I've seen people with extreme dark lives when they were kids being completely resilient. And then I've seen people with like a little like critical mother, and it's like they can't get out of it. So the event itself is not an indicator of your prognosis or your future possibility and your future growth. It's really more about how you work with these defenses and how curious you are and how open you are to look at them. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Soul Sessions with Creative Mind. I'm Debra Berndt Maldonado, here with Dr. Rob Maldonado.
Yes, today we're talking about why you get defensive.
Ooh, are you looking at me? We all get defensive and why it's normal and how it really, all the defense mechanisms we're going to talk about, including our wonderful inspiration for expanding this knowledge, Anna Freud. But before we begin, I want to just remind you to subscribe to our channel. If you're watching us on YouTube, just click the button here in the corner and you'll be able to get every episode and notifications. Make sure you click that little bell so you can get those notifications. And if you're listening to us on one of the podcast services like Spotify, iTunes, just don't forget after the show or right now, just click on subscribe. We have a great series ahead and you do not want to miss any episode.
Speaking of the series, this is a continuing podcast episode on the series of great minds in psychology. Mm-hmm. And by great minds, of course, we mean that we consider them great because they contributed to the way we work in our coaching model.
You know, too, Rob, I think that we hear a lot of the greats, and if you haven't studied psychology, if you're a coach, that you really don't know all the history sometimes of all these great minds. And just by knowing you for almost 20 years and understanding where do these concepts that we all, have compounded in our personal development journey, where do they come from and how were they created is so fascinating to me. So I hope you find this fascinating as well. And I think this is my favorite, one of my favorites, is the defense mechanisms, because as a coach or if you're in the helping profession and you're working with people, you are going to face people's defense mechanisms. And in your everyday life, your family, your friends, your colleagues at work, you're going to recognize all these concepts just in your everyday life. And it's a normal to have, and we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, so the person that we identify as not really the originator of the idea of defense mechanisms, but certainly one that contributed greatly to our understanding of how defense mechanisms evolve in us as human beings and how we use them is Anna Freud, Fraulein Freud. And she is, of course, the daughter of Sigmund Freud and his number one fan, pretty much, and the one that carried on his work and developed it further.
And so let's talk a little bit about Anna.
Yeah, so Vienna in the 1930s, Europe was starting to get very dark with the rise of the Nazis around that time. World War II was brewing. They had just come through World War I. And Freud did not want to leave Vienna. It was his home where he built his career, where he had his practice and his clients. And one of the main things that convinced him that he needed to go and move the family was that the Nazis picked up Anna and interrogated her for several hours.
Thank God that's all that happened, right?
Yes. His sisters, Freud's sisters, I think he had 3 or 4 sisters, actually stayed in Vienna. And they did not survive the war.
And so he saw when that happened, he said,
when he saw that, let's move to London. And of course, he was already well known. So he had a lot of support, both within Vienna and in London. So he moves the whole family to London, including Anna. Excuse me. She, by that time, is really becoming a great student of her father, a great supporter, and an advocate for his work, of course. So she starts working with children by that time, the Nazis were bombing London, so there was a big effort to protect the children. So a lot of the kids would leave their families and go and stay in these, I think they call them war nurseries.
Like wards, and because the men went to war, and then the women basically went to work to uphold the society. So there was no one, they needed someplace to put the kids and keep them safe, right? Move them out of the...
Move them out of harm's way, because they were the bombs were essentially falling on the city, and so you never knew which building was going to get hit. And so they would move them out to the country, different smaller towns where they could be safe. So she got interested, from learning from her dad. Of course, she was interested in the ego then, and kind of found her niche in that. She was more focused on looking at, okay, as kids, how do we start to develop this thing we call the ego, and how do we use these defense mechanisms to protect that ego?
And so she looked at these children who were pulled away from their family, who had like the worst case of maybe trauma and fear and all that, and said, okay, let's see what's happening. And defense mechanisms, do you want to just explain what that is, just as a topic? Description of what it is?
Yeah, and first of all, there was a school, or there is a school that developed out of her work that's called ego psychology, that uses a lot of her work and her formulation of the ego and defenses for therapeutic purposes. So ego psychology is very strong, and still is worked in many, especially in the big cities in Europe as well.
So the ego, let's just kind of frame it as the ego is the concept of the I, the person that's I am, like this self-concept that we have, that your name, your body, your kind of that I need to survive. I need to socially fit in. I need to be loved, right? I need to be healthy. I need to be strong. Those to survive in this world.
Yeah. So Freud's idea of the ego is very interesting. Different than Jung's, of course, in this way. So Freud thought of the ego as the reality principle. Like it's the one that tells us what is real. Let's keep it real. Kind of when we say that, that's what we mean, right? Let's stay in our ego. And then there was his id, like it was a little devil in us that was always prompting us to do what's pleasing, what's pleasurable, what we want to do.
Like the wild side of animal nature. Yeah.
On one side, and on the other side of the ego was the superego, which was the moralistic, you should not do this or that.
Like your parents' voice?
Yeah, the parents' voice, the preacher's voice, the church,
or even the society, the governments, and like what
authority.
The authority.
Yeah. And so the ego was always caught between these two opposing forces that were pushing and pulling in different directions. And so the strong ego was thought to be really important in order to stay in the middle, right?
So don't allow yourself to go too much to the wild side, but also you still want to listen to that moral side, but you want to have your own sort of identity. You want to, or you're more aligned with the moral side.
Yeah, certainly being rigid and following rules obsessively would be
like almost like it's like a spectrum in a way. Like you're kind of like the extreme of wild and then the extreme of ultra. Like have to follow all the rules and have to be so can't take a risk and can't let it like be bad and almost to in a destructive way where you're not free. You feel this kind of. I think that's what happens when people in religion, sometimes they can get where they can't, they're hyper moralistic. And then it's like, but inside they like want to express other things, but they can't. And an healthy ego would be something that I hear both of you, but I'm going to choose. Yeah. But in the beginning as kids, we don't have that choice. We don't have that maturity yet. So we're kind of reacting and creating like a conditioned self.
Yeah. So the ego needed defenses in order to kind of dampen the anxiety that arises from the conflict that is going on in the psyche.
We all have a conflict. It's not this. What life brings us a lot of conflicts, and how we deal with it is we needed a mechanism to help us deal with it.
Right. So this is an oversimplification, of course, of the model, but essentially that's what Freud was saying. Right. Freud was saying this. And so Anna then kind of ran with this idea. And when she was working with the kids then in these kind of stressful circumstances, because they were separated from the parents and the family, so the kid was isolated, and then they were in a stressful war situation, of course. So a lot of her work also played into attachment theory later on with Bowlby and Ainsworth. But the ego and the defense mechanisms are really interesting, because she was able to look at, okay, how do these kids defend themselves and protect themselves and survive
from going crazy, from all the the mind would kind of lose itself in that. So we had to find a way to hold the ego, get yourself together, hold yourself together, basically, right?
Pretty much.
Kind of, we can't let our mind get in too much fear, because we won't be able to function. So the defense mechanisms were actually a sign of a healthy mind, ability to kind of help the child survive. And we have them today, even if you don't have you haven't lived through a war. Some people have lived through wars. Right now, there's kids in Ukraine living through this kind of being pulled away from their parents. It's happened all over recently, in the world. So it's not happening anymore. But but most of us, even if we haven't, we still have these defense mechanisms, because the concept is that you're in this world and you have to deal with all these conflicts and these things that are coming at us. We're never fully loved the way we want to be loved. We're never fully safe in the world. The world is full of lots of things. And so we need the defense mechanisms to survive, whether it's a very light, critical family, or a parent dying, or, death of a grandparent, all that stuff. How do you deal with that as a child? The first day of school, being bullied, being, left out, all those things that contribute to a child trying to cope with life.
Yeah. And of course, this plays into personality development. And so a lot of the theories in psychology about personality, how do we develop this idea of personality, right? Of our particular way of being in the world. Defense mechanisms explain a big chunk of that. And so her work is really interesting in that regard. So I was thinking we could look at a partial list of some of the defense mechanisms
There's a lot of them,
she identified as important, and then kind of discuss how they play into coaching, personal development in general, maybe even a little bit of psychopathology.
And even your own personal self-reflection, because looking at these, I'm like, oh, wow, I use that defense, or my family uses that defense, and understanding that it's not really, it's not like a natural part of your person, that's who you are. It's a defense mechanism versus a personality trait.
Well, that's a good question.
It becomes a personality trait, but it's not on a root from the, the true self. It's not really your true self. It's your defensive self, your conditioned self.
Certainly from a Jungian perspective, that would be the case.
But from a Freudian perspective, it's who you are, and you're that type of person. And did Anna believe that we can overcome these defense mechanisms, or did you think did she believe they were baked in and you just have to cope and deal with them?
Somewhere in between. I think anybody that practices psychotherapy or psychoanalysis understands that there is the opportunity to change and evolve. So the hope was that as she worked with these kids and their families and adults also, that where she saw these defense mechanisms, she could help them deal with them in a more enlightened and creative way. And
so for a defense mechanism is basically the mechanism to preserve the ego, to keep anything that's overwhelming or not appropriate in the system, to kind of keep the ecosystem going.
Yeah, so remember the anxiety factor, right? So a lot of the defenses were meant to protect the ego from being overwhelmed by anxiety from the id from the unconscious mind, that kind of where we're coming up from.
Almost like a homeostasis where the body, like if you get too hot, you sweat. If you get too cold, you're shivering to build up the energy. And so this is almost like the psyche also. I don't know if people realize that the psyche has a balancing element and a kind of a compensation element to keep you from insanity, basically, because we need this world. The mind is such a burden sometimes to have. So let's talk about regression, that as a defense mechanism.
Yeah, so regression, because she was looking at development, was a big part of it, right? Because in development, we go through these stages where we're always challenged to step up, right, and develop new skills and new abilities. So when we're under stress, we tend to regress to something we know already, but it's a lower level of maturity.
Something that we're comfortable with instead of stepping up and maturing. Yeah. And so people that have like blankets, like the baby blankets that they carry into adulthood, there's some people that do that. It's that kind of idea that it's an anchoring into what's familiar.
Yeah, I remember when I was in college, I lived with some roommates, and before I went to college, I remember it was like, when there was tension in the family, I would lock myself up in my room, right? That was a typical teenager kind of thing. In college, though, I was kind of feeling more like an adult, right? But I remember a specific incident where it was stressful and there was some arguments going on. And I did that. I saw myself going to and locking myself up in my room and turning up the music. That's regression right there, right?
So if you're in a relationship and someone does, like they're doing something that every time something gets too intense, they may not lock themselves in the room, may go for a run, they may, put on blaring music or whatever it is, or it's that defense. It's like something I can't handle it. Instead of staying and being with it, it's a way to go back. Repression is really a big defense that I think we all can deal with. Jung's took that to another level with the shadow work, repressing the shadow. But sometimes we repress memories because they're too, like we have a traumatic event and we're like, I don't want to ever remember that. So we don't even remember it in our short-term memory. It just it just goes right in. And so we don't even, some people have that kind of amnesia after something and I don't remember what happened because the ego can't even process it. Is that what happens?
Well, these a lot of or most of these defenses are unconscious, meaning we're not aware of them. Yeah. So it's more that the psyche is on automatic function.
So the psyche decides this is too intense.
Yeah, we're not doing it consciously.
Yeah.
So repression is the mind's ability to when something is difficult or unsavory. Unpleasant, it pushes it into the unconscious mind.
So a lot of people repress anger. And so this kind of projection onto other people, we'll talk about projection too, but we repress like, oh, I'm a good person. And then we're repressing sexual urges, like the id, that would be a form of repression, right?
That's right.
The id, like I really want to quit my job and just go crazy and be an artist during the circus kind of thing. But we repress it because it's not something that is going to help us survive, but it's not conscious. It's that kind of hidden deep desires that we don't access. Right. Reaction formation. I love this one because
I know it's one of your favorites.
It's one of my favorites. It's a weird name. Reaction
formation. Did you ever
formation.
use it? That's the question.
Did I ever use it? Oh, I think I have. It's acting the opposite of how you feel. So a great example of this, I always use this as an example in our trainings. It's that you run into your ex-boyfriend and he's with his new girlfriend that he cheated on you with, and you're at the grocery store, and instead of raging in anger and saying, you mother jerk, and explicits and just being like out of control, you hug the woman. Or you hug the guy. So great to meet you, Jim. Oh my God, it's been so long. And you're just really fake and you know it, but you don't realize why. And then afterwards you don't realize like, why didn't I just yell at him? He was such a jerk. But you're like, you have to be nice. And it's almost like an extreme, like to the anger that you feel, it's like you're overly nice. Like there's just like being pleasant and everything, but you're like almost like over the top to match the intensity of the hate or the anger. And so you act the opposite.
Yeah.
And so we see our parents sometimes do that, like when they're frustrated with us and they like be overly nice You're like, wait, what's going on here?
It's almost like overcompensating in the opposite direction. Instead of regressing, you're kind of trying to say, I'm a bigger person than that.
Yeah.
Therefore, I'm going to express this higher level of being, but it's not genuine.
Yeah.
Right. It's
and you feel fake. You kind of feel fake, and you're just like, why did I act that way? Why didn't I say what I felt? And it's a automatic reaction.
Yeah.
Isolation.
Yeah. So isolation. I mean, I think we all know this one is
Closing yourself in your room.
That one, or staying away in the playground. Right. We see kids that just stay away from the group and find a little corner and play by themselves.
Well, we see this when we do free trainings and stuff. There's the people that are really interested and kind of interacting, and then the other people that are just kind of watching, and they're not really ready to participate. They feel like, I want to ask a question, but I don't, or, it's almost like, so what would be the defense against that? Is that connection? Like isolation is a kind of like wearing like a guard around you, like a armor?
Yeah, I think all these defense mechanisms are kind of a character armor, right? They protect us from, again, that anxiety-producing event or situation. And the anxiety-producing event can be external or internal. In other words, it can be something from within us, some impulse from the id, or some questionable moralistic situation that kind of calls up the superego in us and says, you shouldn't be doing that.
Dissociation. I learned a lot about this with people that had traumas. They basically pull themselves out of their body and they don't know how to be in their body. And actually, I think a lot of people, when I work with people that are really intellectuals and they're afraid of, they're not afraid, but they don't know it, but they're not in touch with their emotions. It's almost like they're out of their bodies in a way. Like their energy is like in their head, and they're not able to kind of associate with the emotion.
Yeah.
But it is a defense because maybe emotions were too much, where they were like, if a parent was like overly emotional, and they may be like, I can't handle all that energy, and then they can't handle it within themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I remember this from my clinical training that a lot of the kids, as adults, then remembered when their abuse was happening. They were out of their body, essentially. They were looking at the situation from the ceiling, looking down at what was going on. Yeah,
it was like a way to protect them from, like the witness, like when we work with emotions, we do that. And it helps us kind of look at it in a more objective way. But yes, when I did regressions as a hypnotherapist, oftentimes a traumatic event would be, they were like, I'm on the ceiling. And we had to like integrate them back into their body. Projection, that's a common word. You're projecting.
Yeah, projection is seeing the unpleasant attributes in you in another person. And we're all good at that as human beings. We can clearly see other people's faults, that the mote in our brother's eye instead of the beam in our own eye. And it's a defense mechanism. It's a way to protect ourselves because we're off the hook. It's them that are being that way. Therefore, we're safe.
Because of the self-judgment that we have if we were that way, it's unacceptable to identify with those qualities. Yeah. So the anger, it's unacceptable to identify with the anger, so you project it onto other people. They're the angry ones, or they're the ones who are judging. I'm not a judging person. I'm very open and loving and kind. And then you see it out in another person. And that comes to this moral masochism. I think we can all relate to this. People have it, and all of these have extremes, don't they?
Yeah, these again are typical and normal. In other words, they're healthy for the ego. They only become problematic when they become rigid, when the individual is always doing this defensive mechanism and not flexible.
Yeah. So it's like a person that no matter, you try to have a conversation with them and they're always like pushing back, and you can't really reach them. You're trying to have a conversation, but all you're getting back is, we can all relate to people like that. They just like always defensive. And it's like kind of more like a problematic for that person because they're not allowing anyone in. They're not even allowing themselves to be humbled It's like kind of a strong armor, that character armor again.
Yeah, in Freud psychology, narcissism was considered a healthy attribute in human beings. In other words, you need to look out for yourself, right? So you need a good dose of that. But it became problematic only when it was too much, right? It was the go-to defense mechanism or strategy in dealing with others.
So the moral masochism is one, but then the narcissism is kind of the other. So let's talk about moral masochism first as a defense. It's that harsh, like putting yourself down. And we all have it, but some people have it like in a deeper way where that's all, they can't get out of it. It's like automatic that they think they're just terrible. They're terrible, terrible, terrible. They're a loser. They can't do anything with their life. And it's that pattern. But it sounds like low self-esteem, where someone would say, oh, that's low self-esteem. But it's really a defense mechanism. Why would that be? Why would ego use that as a defense?
Right. It could be that the anxiety over too much narcissism is kind of like you mentioned, that homeostasis mechanism of finding the balance between the two.
So, for example, if a parent was narcissistic, say they had that, and we think about narcissism like as the opposite of moral masochism, the narcissism is also a defense. And so, if the parent was like that label narcissistic, it was all about them. The person, to avoid being like the parent, they would be harsh on themselves. So it's almost like the opposite, like they're mirrors of each other in a way. Like the narcissist is like, it's all about me and I'm so great and I can't let myself have any failures. Yeah. And then the masochism's like, I can't let myself have any greatness. And so they're kind of mirrors of each other. So when a parent is narcissistic, the child may use that as they could be narcissistic too and carry that on, or they can be the opposite where like, you know what, I don't want to be like that at all. They're pushing that away. So this other element comes in to push away the glory or any kind of praise. They can't accept anything, where the narcissist can't accept any criticism. The masochist thinks about only their, the harsh putting themselves down is actually helping them in some way.
Yeah, I mean, in psychology, the human beings are so complicated, and each individual has their unique way of defending
so it's not
themselves.
We don't want to generalize, but that's
Right.
like an example of how these two are. One is extreme harshness, and one is extreme, I'm the God and I'm the best, and it's a defense mechanism. It's not, because underneath we know narcissists are scared and weak, and it's like this big persona. And so carrying the persona of this weak person, and I'm like this helpless person, and I hate myself, and all that is a defense from being connecting to your glory, your magnificence. There's something scary about that kind of like feeling great about yourself.
Yeah, for certain individuals, that would be the case, right? That produces anxiety in them. Maybe they were punished by the parent if they stood out and became more brilliant than their siblings or something like that, right?
I think I have that because I was, I always wanted to be the shining star and it was not always accepted. And so I had to, maybe that's why I use that a little bit to kind of beat myself up when we beat ourselves up. So again, these are not pathological. These are very human things. So if you beat yourself up, it doesn't mean you have this defense mechanism and it's terrible. It's like recognizing it, like what's the benefit I get from beating myself up? It's a defense. It's not low self-esteem. It appears that way, that you have low self-esteem, because it's the symptoms are showing that. But what really is happening is you're defending something. So defensive denial.
Right. So we all have heard about denial, right? It's a defense mechanism. Defensive would just be that it's in the service of the ego.
So it's kind of like I need to be right type of thing. Like I can't be wrong. Would that be a defensive denial?
That could be part of it, yes.
Where someone's like, I want to tell you how I feel. And they're like, nope, that wasn't me. I don't act that way.
Yeah, anything that threatens the ego, then denial can be used as a way to protect itself.
It's not just a river in Egypt.
Yeah, and not just part of the grieving process as we know it.
Sublimation.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So sublimation, a simple example is dancing. Sublimation means the substitution of an acceptably social behavior for an unacceptably social behavior. So instead of grabbing the opposite sex, or let's say a man grabbing a woman and saying, kiss me, can we dance? Let's dance, right?
And it's kind of like
it's socially
subtle,
acceptable.
yeah.
You're getting close. You're able to speak in a very intimate kind of situation. So that's sublimation, that we find ways to express deeper primal urges in a socially acceptable way. I don't know that one.
Okay, denigration.
Denigration, yeah.
That's like, those people are such jerks, or those people are wrong, and like putting other people down to lift yourself up.
Yeah.
If you feel low, if you have that moral masochism, you may want to put people down because you need to kind of have that. It's like a superiority.
Yeah, it's this idea that some people try to make themselves taller by chopping other people's heads off, right? If other people aren't as good, then maybe you're a little bit better.
So let's say someone who makes a lot of money, or your boss, or you find a way to put them down, like, oh, they're so superficial, and I love being poor and spiritual, and you're kind of denigrating them for what they're doing, and it's a way to feel like kind of like something that you're pushing away. That in a way, I mean, they all kind of go together, like denigration and projection and all that. You're kind of examining that, but that's a really good one too. Criticism, when you're highly critical, it's kind of a defense.
Yeah. So maybe for the sake of time, let's just hit some important ones here.
I love this one, identification with the aggressor. That was something when you told me that, it was really, really interesting about the transfer of power when people, especially in abusive situations, they, there's like, what's going on there?
Yeah. And of course, this is a direct observation from working with kids, right? That if kids are often in physically abusive situations, for example, they still want to be with a parent. So the question becomes like, why would they want to stay with a parent that is hurting them? And
then the social worker's taking them away to a safe place, and the kid's grasping at the parent like, mommy, daddy, I want to be with you.
Yeah. It's because of this identification with the aggressor. It's a complicated mechanism, but think about it this way. The child needs to feel powerful enough to sustain the ego, right? Because the ego is that sense of ourselves, right? Of a viable self in us. If the ego doesn't have enough power, it would not survive. It essentially would say, I can't do this. I can't go out into life and make it happen. So that need for power, where does it come from? The child looks at the parent, the strong parent, and often it's the aggressor towards them, and they say, well, they have the power, so therefore I have to identify with them.
Is that why abuse is carried from generation to generation?
It's
the
one
person,
of the,
they transfer, they borrow that power of abuse to get their own power, because that's the only way they understood power?
This is done emotionally, remember, and done unconsciously as well. So the child is not choosing to identify with someone that's hurting them, but they need to feel powerful enough to survive. Therefore, the only example they have of power is this aggressor. And so they have to identify with the aggressor.
Does that mean that they become aggressive too? They can be very aggressive with other people by like a trigger reaction.
Yes,
so it's like they get angry at people really easily, but because they're borrowing the aggressor's anger or the aggression, they're borrowing that to transfer that and use it in the world, because aggression is power to that person, or unconsciously.
That's right. That's one of the mechanisms that might account for why we see intergenerational patterns of abuse in families and so forth.
And then also people that have been, sometimes they can be aggressive, or with people that are trying to help them, they can push back, right? Like kids pushing back, or a therapist, getting angry at the therapist, but because they're using that aggression, like in as their power.
Yeah.
What about Yeah, well, I want to talk about this one first. Projective identification, the opposite. So instead of identifying with the aggressor, you're identifying also like with someone who is like idealistic. So let's say your grandmother was the most beautiful angel in the world, and she's so like amazing, and everyone admired her, and you want to identify with that icon, which a lot of people have that in their life too. We not only have, people around us that kind of roughed us up a bit, but there's also these people that we idolize. And so identifying with that idolization, because our ego doesn't see ourselves that way. So it's like a defense mechanism to use that to build our ego up.
Yeah, if you think about, and I've done this myself, I've observed it in me, when you don't feel confident, right, which means your ego doesn't feel strong, you tend to identify with people that are strong around in your environment.
So it's celebrities,
or even other people,
like guys, like the tough guy in the action films, the leader, projecting that onto leaders and authoritarians. Like, ooh, they have all this power. I want to be like, kind of, if I'm associated with that leader, I get the power.
You're right, but remember, we're doing this unconsciously.
Yes, yeah, we're not saying, "Oh, I want to be like them," but why are we drawn? Like, it's almost like it's subtle. Like, why are we unconsciously drawn?
We might
to those
start
people?
To speak like them, or act that way, or act like.
And again, this isn't pathological. This is even identify with the aggressor. It's not pathological. We do that just. If someone is critical to us and we become critical, it's a very subtle thing. There's extremes of this in every case, in every human beings throughout human nature. But most of us don't have those extremes. Most of us are just kind of trying to have a healthy ego. So let's go to two more. I think this is really one that I can relate to, especially because I'm one of those highly sensitive people, and apathic withdrawal, that where I felt like my father was that way, like he kind of pulled back his emotions. And I know I do that when I'm in a crowd and there's so much energy, and I almost like feel people pulling at me, or I can I'm over like processing, and I'm not grounded. I could feel myself get cold and kind of shut down. It's like almost like a defense is just too much. Yeah. And so those of you who are highly sensitive or empaths, you may have this as a defense just because it's just too much. Like it's you can feel a lot more than a lot of people. Like it's a kind of one of your kind of traits that you have more access to, and then you do this as a defense because it's too much.
Yeah, most of us know apathy. Apathy means we're kind of disengaged. We're not really kind of paying attention or interested in what's going on. Withdrawal, again, that just kind of staying in ourselves and focusing on our own mind kind of thing.
But it also could be, if you're not highly sensitive, someone who that's their kind of way of being, where it's like, I don't care what people think. There's people that are like, oh, I don't care what people think, and almost like you can't get to me, like highly. So it's like there's an extreme where you can use it as a tool in like a situation, like a handy tool, but also, you can. It could be part of your like way of being. Is like I just don't care. I just don't care. But you really do. It's just unconscious that you're doing that.
Right. Yeah. It's a defense mechanism again that you've learned, or your ego has learned, in order to protect itself.
So, for example, if someone, like a parent had some kind of tragedy and they had to go raise children, they may have had to do something to kind of withdraw from all that energy and all their emotions and kind of have a little coldness, maybe, from like they learn it from their parent, like they're cold, so I'm going to be cold, and that's just the way to be. Okay, and then the last one is kind of funny. We all do this, is humor as a defense.
Humor is funny.
Why are you looking at me? Yeah. This is my family's defense. It's always, instead of saying directly what we feel, we tease each other. Instead of saying I love you, I'm just going to tease you. I'm going to like give you a little twist of the knife a little bit, and kind of like humor or joke around or laugh it off versus really going in. How else do you see humor?
Yeah, and it works really well most of the time, but sometimes we see that it doesn't really work, right? Because it's inappropriate, or the joke is a little bit off, or it feels to be off.
Or people, like I see people laughing when they're talking about something serious. So I see this a lot when I would coach someone, and they're like laughing off their this like a kind of a deep thing that they're talking about, like, oh, my mother was so critical, ha 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 ha, and they laugh, and it feels like more of a nervous laugh than a real laugh. So we see this in people, we may notice it in ourselves, but it's a defense mechanism of, I really want to go there, so I'm going to lighten it up.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And so actually when my father died, we did a lot of that, joking around and stuff, because it was like so hard for us all to cope. And so it's a sign of a healthy mind, but if we use it in a rigid way, it keeps people from us, it keeps us from growing. And so what we want to do with all these defense mechanisms is really see them as a defense, and then ask ourselves, well, what are we really defending? And noticing these patterns in ourselves and asking ourselves, what am I afraid of? Like, why did I act that way? Like, and it's unconscious, so you don't want to beat yourself up for it, get into more moral masochism, but you want to recognize it and get curious about it.
Yeah. One of the mistakes that we often see is people think that these defenses are pathological, that they kind of point to some kind of wound, some kind of trauma, some kind of damage. Now, it could be, of course, but most of the time, because these are natural aspects of the ego, they're simply, again, the way the individual has learned to cope with anxiety, with the world, etc.
I often hear people use the term trauma response, which is like they're referring to these defenses. But it kind of makes the people that have suffered a lot of deep trauma, like it's like almost like it discounts their experience. And so we want to like see that all of us have these defenses, whether you had the worst situation or an easy life, we all have defense mechanisms because we all have an ego. And so we learn, through our through our parents and people around us, what their go-to defense is, and they basically adopt it unconsciously, and we pass it along, or we try it, I guess, as kids, what works, and then we find something that fits, and we're like, okay, I'm going to do this from now on. This seems to work, and so it's all sign of a healthy mind. And I've seen people with extreme dark lives when they were kids being completely resilient, and then I've seen people with like a little like critical mother, and it's like they can't get out of it. So the event itself is not an indicator of your prognosis or your future possibility and your future growth. It's really more about how you work with these defenses and how curious you are and how open you are to look at them. Now, there is extremes, and that would be, working with that rigidness. What would you say for someone who is experiencing that? The rigid, they feel like they can't get out of it, or they're really stuck.
I think that's certainly the realm of therapy, right? Psychotherapy. And there are people that are specifically trained to work at that level. And it does require extensive, deep training. This is not something most people can do regardless of their intentions, right? We all want to help people, but there are people, if they really are suffering from PTSD and trauma, they require specialized assistance. And so, in our coaching model, though, these understanding the defense mechanisms is important, because the goal of Jungian individuation is to transcend the ego. So a lot of the work has to do with dismantling a lot of these character defenses, because they keep the individual from understanding their true self. Because
even as the ego, we're not the ego. So we're defending and protecting this thing that's not even who we really are. And in Jung's work, he take it further than Freud, which is like you're transcending the ego. You're not using these mechanisms to make a better personality and shine up the ego. We're actually transcending it and recognizing the more conscious we are of these defenses, which are mostly unconscious. I mean, if you may be like thinking, oh, I have that too. This is not for you to diagnose yourself with any kind of trauma. This is really for you to say, oh, that's interesting. Let me be curious about why I do that. And whatever the reason is, it was there as a healthy mind. It was there in a good intention. But we don't have to rely on that anymore as adults and conscious beings. As kids, we were the world was coming at us. So we had to kind of really make sure we had a strong ego to survive the first part of life. But the second part of life, we want to basically choose consciously how do we want to respond to the world versus always with the defenses.
And these are powerful defenses, meaning they protect us against difficult situations. And so that we're not really harmed. The ego is very resilient. The mind is very resilient. And if you're able to function and kind of even put up a good front, that's a sign of a healthy mind, like you say. And it's simply that, is there work to do? Of course, we all have work to do. That's what personal development is about. That's what the human potential movement is about. It's about finding ways to go beyond this mere survival, and go to full potential.
And so when we're in these, and when you're reviewing yourself and assessing yourself, what a lot of people do, self-diagnosing, we want to look at it as, we're going to want to be conscious of these things and understand that that's not who we are. Like, even what is the ego doing, and that it's coming from the ego, and the ego's not who we are. So great session today, Rob. I enjoyed this conversation immensely because it shows so much about who we are and what we, how we really survive in the world. And again, I don't want anyone to think there's something wrong with you. If you have these defense mechanisms or you recognize it in yourself, it's good that you recognize it and really ask that deeper question. Be curious.
Yes.
So we'll see you next week on another Soul Sessions. Again, don't forget to subscribe. Click the button here, to subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube. And if you are listening to us right now on Spotify, iTunes, as you're listening to the out music, saying goodbye, please don't forget to click that little subscribe button on your podcast service so you can get next week's episode, which you don't want to miss.